Slideshow, please.
Right. So the topic today is research perspectives and interpretative linguistics. I like to take up 3 questions before I move into this. The first one is, who all are going to be benefited? For whom it is meant? My answer is, this is going to actually help the students, the teachers who are engaged in teaching linguistics, apply linguistics in different levels in graduation and post-graduation levels. And number 2, what is that I'm going to do, the structure of my presentation? Well, I like to do 3 things here. I like to start this presentation with a brief introduction to research in the field of linguistics. What are the different research activities taking place right now? I'm talking about the recent trends. I'm not going to focus on the normal, that has been traditional. I'm not going to focus that. So I'm going to talk about only research in the field of linguistics, particularly in right now, how research is taking place. Then I try to locate this interpretative linguistics within the broader spectrum. And then I talk about different theories and assumptions of interpretative linguistics. This is the second thing. The third question is, how this language of this session going to be? We are not going to talk about linguistics per se, pure linguistic per se. It's going to be interpretative linguistics. It's going to be a kind of philosophical understanding of linguistics, an interconnection between philosophy and linguistics. So for this, we need to have a kind of language appropriate to this context. Hence, forgive me sometimes if I go overboard. Things will be made very clear if you have patience with me. At the end, I'll take up some questions. I'll be able to clarify your doubts if you have any. So with this opening remarks, I think I can start my session. Welcome to this session on interpretative linguistics. Particularly, the focus is going to be on research perspectives in the field of interpretative linguistics. A word of caution. I've been telling you, I'm not going to talk about linguistics. I'm going to talk about interpretative linguistics. Some of you over there might be wondering, is it something connected to discourse studies? Am I going to talk about discourse analysis? Of course. It could be connected to discourse studies and discourse analysis, but not purely from discourse perspective as such. Discourse studies, discourse analysis, part of this area, interpretative studies. So it's a kind of a conglomeration, amalgamation, a broader spectrum of interpretative studies. So all the things going to be accommodated within this short period. So that's when I discuss this, I'll be talking about some of the important core areas of this. Let me share with you what I'm going to do. I'm going to start with what is this interpretative linguistics all about? How was the focus in the field of linguistics until 1952? And then what are the application aspects in the field of interpretative linguistics? Then evolutionary facets in this particular field, and then broader spectrum, research paradigm, and major forces in this field, and core principles which underline interpretative linguistics. And finally, I'll talk about research scope, and then I conclude. We'll take up some questions. So this is going to be this is how I have organized this presentation. Now, the focus until 1952, I'm talking about research focus in the field of linguistics until 1952, was very much limited to splitting out different areas of grammatical theory. Now, grammatical theory can be roughly broken down into smaller units such as semantics, pragmatics, syntax, and so on, morphology, phonetics, so on and so forth. So focus until 1952 was only limited to grammatical theory. But later on, after post-1952, thanks to the demands of the context, thanks to the technological revolution, information technology revolution, thanks to our increased understanding of the use of language, we try to move beyond this grammatical theory, and we started looking more into the application aspect. Here, in application aspect, there are many things interconnected within the field of linguistics. For example, language learning, language teaching, very many issues connected to language learning, language teaching, identifying issues and conducting action research, applying reflective practice, and then coming to conclusion. So this is one area post 1952 dominated our discussion. Number two, very many theories related to language learning and teaching. A lot of research has taken place applying theories of language learning and language teaching. My dear friends, I'm not talking about mentalism and behaviorism. These are all predominant theories. I'm not talking about theories supported by sociocultural theories supported by Vygotsky and all. No, I'm talking about the theories in between these two. There are a lot of theories in between mentalism and behaviorism. The theory in between either supporting mentalism or behaviorism, or sometimes supporting both or not supporting any of these two, but being influenced by these two major theories, mentalism and behaviorism. So research in the field of theory is taking place. But what is interesting here is applying culture theories on language teaching that was taking place post 1952. If you ask me to give some examples, I like to start with John Scuman's acculturation theory. John Scuman talks about social factors and psychological factors influencing language learning and language teaching. John Scuman talks about political, cultural, economic domination influencing our perspectives of second language. So these are all important dimensions over there. When I say applying culture theories, John Scuman's acculturation is not the only thing. It's to begin with. We have socio-cultural theory, and we have socio-linguistic theory supported by guilds. We have variable competence model, and we have monitor model supported by Crazen, and so many other theories over there. So research in the field of theories taking place post 1952. And then language testing and evaluation. In testing and evaluation, what we do, we conduct tests, we administer tests, and we gather inputs. And what we do with the inputs, we do a lot of things. We try to analyze the input to arrive at conclusions. We try to analyze the inputs from the angle of the growth, language, how much the student has actually acquired, the growth, achievement level of the students, learning styles and learning strategies adopted by the student, and anxiety level of the students. And then we come to conclusions. We take decisions, informed decisions, applying language testing and evaluation. And then language policy. Language policy is all about language governance. It includes three things: language beliefs, language practices, and language management. All the three things connected to language governance, research taking place in the field of language. Or even today, we have been receiving a lot of PhD theses on this language policy because it is politically connected. Political, governmental influence is always there in determining language policy. That is an area. But I'm not going to talk about all these, but these are all important. These are the things I would say coming under, application aspects of language study. But that which really concerns me is the last one, evolutionary facets of language. What do I mean by that? Have a look at this. When I say evolutionary facets, I talk about interpretative studies. This is where I try to bring in two different fields, the two fields which have been mutually indifferent. I would say they have been reciprocally indifferent. For example, sociology, linguistics, reciprocally indifferent, nowhere connected, but they are coming together. Language and mind, psychology and linguistics coming together, psycholinguistics, anthropology, linguistics coming together, anthropological linguistics, law and linguistics, forensic linguistics. So these are the fields nowhere connected until 1952. But these fields are coming together and we have new areas. Now, these things, whatever I have listed out there, these things are brought under interpretative studies. Here, Interpretative linguistics is actually a connection between linguistics and philosophy. I like to take a pause and I like to discuss a little bit about each of these, and then I'll move over to interpretative linguistics. My dear friends, I'm talking about, or I'm discussing where this interpretative linguistics is actually located, the location of this, so that you will understand it in the broader spectrum. Language and society, variation study, it is about social linguistics. A lot of research is taking place in this field, variation studies. I'll talk about variation studies in connection with interpretative linguistics a little later. What kind of research is taking place there? In variation studies, that is social linguistics and social linguistics, that is interconnection between linguistics and sociology, we talk about how people use language. And we try to form opinion, conclusions based on the varieties and variations people have in their language use. Variety and variation both are different. Variety is language variety, the differences existing between one language and another language. But variation is differences existing within the same language. That is what is called dialectical study. So what do we do there in language and society or in variation study? We try to gather data about language use, the differences reflecting in language use, and we try to come to some conclusions based on which. I have done my research on this particular field, variation study, by applying very many linguistic theories coming under variation study on the works of Toni Morrison. I try to look at Toni Morrison's language. You all know that the language used by Toni Morrison is, Afro-American vernacular dialect. In Afro-American vernacular dialect, you'll find certain features like morphological, syntactic, semantic, phonetic, and phonological features. And all these features, they are actually making that Afro-American variety different from standard American English. Mind here, I'm not going to evaluate and grade, in what way one variety, better than the other variety. I'm not going to use that kind of language. I am conducting this research only to bring out the difference between one variety and another variety. And my job is only to bring out the difference. So the difference between one variety and another variety is only difference. Glorifying difference is actually a mark of our civilization, not grading it. So the pigeonized, people say pigeonized variety, and how actually that particular language, Afro-American vernacular English, has become an accepted one. So a discussion on that is also coming under interpretative. So it's a very interesting field. Those of you who like to do research in the field of interpretative studies, you can look at it from variation study perspective or social linguistic perspective. That's very important. What are we going to achieve through that? We can achieve a few things. Number one, we will be able to understand that all these differences are because of the factors like geography, ethnicity, that is race, and then education, sex, and then the context where we are placed. These are the factors which influence the kind of language we use. So the choice of a language, the way in which a person uses language, influenced by very many different factors. Hence, we should not find fault with a particular person's language, and we should not form opinion, and we should not form decisions. We should not arrive at decisions based on a person's language. All these are different varieties, and we need to celebrate these different varieties. I think this is how democratization of mind taking place. Understanding, accepting, glorifying differences, encourage the differences, all these differences here to say. So that is how we will take this variation study. So we will discuss this little later. And psycholinguistics, I think you all are aware of that, the interconnection between psychology and language. How can we, solve language problems by applying psycholinguistic theories, lambda law, neurolinguistics theory, psycholinguistics or neurolinguistics, they deny the presence of LAD, language acquisition device, as supported by Chomsky. They said there is nothing called language acquisition device in your mind. Language learning is something to do with your neural mechanism, So it is network of mind. Your mind is actually millions of networks of mind. So millions of network, and that is what is contributing to learning. So in psycholinguistics, the mental factors, psychological factors contributing to language learning, that is being discussed. Anthropology and linguistics, that is another area. So much of research done in this field, and I would strongly advise you to read Edward Hall, Silent Language. That would give you brief introduction, and I would say comfortable, convenient introduction to this field, anthropological linguistics, wherein he talks about 10 elements of culture which contribute to language processing. 10 elements starting with interaction, association, subsistence, bisexuality, language and learning and acquisition, play, defense, territoriality and temporality, and so on and so forth. So that's also an area wherein a lot of research taking place. We will discuss this if time permits little later. Forensic linguistics, interconnection between law and language. In forensic linguistics, what happens is we try to understand the victim narrations. We try to use this forensic linguistics to understand how the literary, legal texts are actually interpreted. How can we apply the knowledge of law? Hello? Hello?
Please continue. Please continue.
Is there anything you'd like to say?
No. They have unknowingly unmuted the audio.
Fine. Do you mean to say that they can? Do you think they can interact with me when I actually discuss?
No. At the end of the session,
that's fine. Okay. Things are clear now. Are you following?
Yes.
Fine. So, in forensic linguistics, what happens is actually, they try to bring together the knowledge of law and knowledge of language to understand how legal text could be interpreted, on how legal texts are written. And now, Truth and Reconciliation Commission, you must have heard of, which was actually established to look into the cases of apartheid in South Africa. The people actually stood before this commission, gave the narration, whatever happened, how they have been victimized. That text right now, huge, it runs into volumes. Well, I would recommend that for post-retirement reading. That's a wonderful material right now for this forensic linguistics. You understand how the victims actually narrate the stories. And then how can we understand in the pain in the narration, applying forensic linguistic theories. But all these are all interpretative studies, but specifically, my focus is going to be interconnection between linguistics and philosophy. It's very interesting. How can we bring linguistics and philosophy together in interpretation? That is what is actually that is the most important aspect of my talk. So language and philosophy, linguistic and philosophy, this is what is called interpretative linguistics. But whatever I said, all these things coming under interpretative studies, language in society, social linguistics, language and mind, psycholinguistics, language and anthropology, anthropological linguistics, language and laws, forensic linguistics, and language and philosophy is interpretative linguistics. All these things coming under interpretative studies, but interpretative linguistics is specifically looking into the gap or the gulf existing between language and philosophy. Now, let's talk about the assumption of this language and philosophy. Let's have a look at this. But before which, before I talk about interpretative linguistics, I want you to have a look at the broader picture here. I want you to just have a look at this broader picture. You can see the screen, please. I'll give you just a minute time for you to read what I have written there. Research in the field of linguistics, two broader areas, grammatical theory, We are not going to talk about grammatical theory, I said very clearly. We are discussing application aspects, language learning and teaching, action research, different theories, language policy, testing evaluation, and evolutionary aspects. In evolutionary aspects, we have interdisciplinary or interpretative studies, within which we have language and society, that is variation study, psycholinguistics, language and mind, language and anthropology, anthropological linguistics, language and law, forensic linguistics, and language and philosophy, interpretative linguistics. That's what we are going to look at now, right now. Have a look at this broader picture. Right? Now, let me start with a question. Language and philosophy, interpretative linguistics. If you look into interpretative linguistics, language and philosophy, what do we do here? That's a question. What do we do here? Here, in interpretative linguistics, we try to investigate only one thing. What is that? We try to investigate, well, what it means to be being. How can we understand the concept of being? I'll discuss this a little later. And how do we construct the concept of being? How do we get to know the things that we know? How do we understand the process of knowledge assimilation? How do we understand the process of knowledge construction? How do we understand the process of knowledge dissemination? How can we understand the gap existing between power and knowledge? How can we understand, how our discourses shape the enterprise of knowledge? How can we understand, why we say what we know is knowledge? So interpretative linguistics, it looks into the most important dimension of knowing. That is, how do we know about being? I'm talking about the conception of being. I discuss this conception of being little later, but that's what interpretative linguistics is all about. In other words, I can say, in interpretative linguistics, we try to look at truth from different dimensions. We try to understand philosophy from linguistic dimension. There is a strong connection between philosophy and linguistics. We try to look at that. So let me sum up for those of you, sometimes when you listen to me on this, I'm sharing too many things. You may get confused. So let me try to simplify. Let me split out what are the things I've said, and then I take you to the rest of the slides so they're easy for you. In interpretative linguistics, the most important thing that we do here is we try to understand what it means to be being, and how can we understand the concept of being. How do we know what we know, and how do we get the knowledge, and how knowledge is constructed, and how discursive practices, in the words of Michel Foucault. I'm talking about Michel Foucault a little later. I'll focus on that theory too. Michel Foucault's theory is a very important theory. So we all discuss here in interpretative studies predominantly the concept of being. That is the most important concept. And if you could understand that, then you'll be able to understand how can we construct our identity, multiple identities. How can we understand and engage ourselves in discourse practices, and how do we actually take part in the process of knowledge construction. I'm talking about the enterprise of knowledge making, the whole business of knowledge making. So these are the things very much connected to interpretative linguistics. So let me talk about research paradigm in interpretative linguistics, or interpretative research for the matter. So interpretative linguistics research paradigm, it's based on three assumptions. The three assumptions are: social reality is not and never singular and objective. Two persons cannot look at the same thing in the same way. No two persons will agree. We all look at things in different dimensions, different angles. social reality can never be singularly and objectively constructed. Now, how are we constructing social reality? We are constructing social reality based on our own understanding of social reality, based on our own experiences, each of us coming from different background. You know, if you ask me to stand up to have a perspective on anything, I can stand up only from my seat. I can't stand up from your seat. So the perspective that we are getting is because of the positioning where we are seated is what we are looking at. So when you look at things from different perspectives, it is not the thing that you are looking at. You are looking at the understanding of the things that you have in your mind inbuilt. You are looking at that when you look at the things outside. So social reality is never and can never be singular, and it is never objective, always shaped by our experiences and social context. This is what is called ontology. Hence, what is extremely important here is socio-cultural context. We have to actually conceive, we have to subjugate everything to this socio-cultural context. So interpretive research paradigm, interpretative linguistics, the assumptions are three, the key assumptions are three. First assumption, social reality can never be singular, can never be objective, always shaped by our experiences. Because we all are from different background and different experiences we have, we cannot have one singular social reality. So shaped by our experiences and social context, hence socio-historic context, very much important in understanding, you know, whatever it is. Now, with which we have to move over to the forces, the major forces. We would not be able to do justice to interpretative linguistics field if we fail to understand these contributions. These are the people phenomenally contributed to the development of the field interpretative linguistics. Michel Foucault, my God, I think I would strongly advise the participants to read. You know, there are plenty of books, but the four books which I have really enjoyed reading, influenced me, which actually brought about a lot of changes in my perspective: Madness and Civilization, The Order of Things, Discipline and Punish, and The History of Sexuality. These are the four phenomenal works by Michel Foucault. In all these four, of course, there are plenty, but the four, in my limited understanding, these four books, which shape my perspective, I could come to only this conclusion. His approach is anti-foundational approach. What is this anti-foundational approach? Wait a minute, we will discuss that too. To satiate your curiosity, I would say anti-foundational approach that implies nothing is fixed. Shake the foundation. There is nothing called foundation. If you look deeper into the foundation, you will understand there are fragments. So foundation is not there. There is nothing called foundation at all. Why there is nothing? There is, epistemology, it is to be replaced by genealogy. Epistemology, it implies, truth, your beliefs and your justification to be replaced by genealogy of knowledge forms. So it is the person that matters. So in anti-foundational approach, Foucault questions the foundation. And yes, he says that, the more, well, this is another interesting assumption. You say, when there is an assumption, the least questioned assumption is the most questionable. So Foucault's understanding is, don't accept anything as fixed. There is nothing called logic. There is nothing called fixed. This is anti-foundational approach. And Derrida's logocentrism, the teachers teaching linguistics in different fields, they understand logocentrism. Center is not at the center. I mean, words do not have self-sufficient meaning. You get the meaning only by relating a word with another word. How do we actually get the meaning? We get the meaning not from the word, but we get the meaning from the context where the word is actually placed. No word has a meaning of its own. But if at all your word has a meaning of its own, but the way the word is going to be placed going to alter and shape the meaning of it. Hence, your word's meaning is shaped by the context where it is actually placed. So your word gets the meaning only from a context. You cannot have one single word and say this word has only this meaning. For example, there are plenty, but I can give one example. If you take the word light, it may have a meaning of its own, but the way in which the word light is going to be placed is going to give the meaning to the word light. The sun gives us light and heat. That is different from a light purse makes a heavy heart. That is different from he is a light man. That is different from light off, please light on. That is actually, if you're confused, I would say take it light. So your word gets the meaning not from within, but from the context. So you need to relate the word to the context. That is what is called logocentrism. So we will discuss that again, if time permits, a little later. And Tompkins' reader response criticism, we should not actually think reader is ignorant. Reader brings a lot of meaning, a lot of value to the text. And Stanley Fish interpretative community, wherein the focus is culture. Culture has its own meaning. Understand the meaning contributed by culture, not language as such. So culture's contribution to meaning making process is Stanley Fish. Reader's contribution is Thompson. And no word has a meaning of its own. Your word gets meaning only when you relate your word to the context. That is contextual communication. It is how contextual contribution to the meaning, and nothing is fixed, is anti-foundational approach by Foucault. And then the last one, interesting one, is de Souza's diatopical hermeneutics. It stands for thematic consideration. I'm talking about diatopical hermeneutics. It stands for thematic consideration of understanding the other without assuming that the other too has almost the same or equal or required basic self-understanding. That's how normally we arrive at conclusions here. So, dear friends, these are the forces, major forces. These are the voices in the field of interpretative linguistics. But these forces, they present interpretative linguistics in multidimensional ways. Foucault's focus is anti-foundational approach. Derrida is contextual contribution. Tompkins is reader's contribution, meaning lies in the consciousness. Stanley Fish is actually culture contribution, and de Souza is hermeneutical, diatopical hermeneutics. That assumption is, don't assume the other person doesn't have a background of his own. The other person also has a background equal to yours. So that's how actually interpretative linguistics being shaped as a field. Now, interpretative linguistics, it is shaped by six core principles. These 6 core principles are drawn from different sources. These are the sources. I've studied these sources and then I have arrived at these 6 core principles. I'll run through these core principles in detail now. I can't give an example, I'm sorry, because of the time constraint, but I can clarify your doubts if you have any little later. The core principles are reality construction, construction of discursive regimes, we will discuss that, knowledge and power relations, limitation of universal rationality, anti-foundational approach, and epistemology and genealogy relation. Let's try to look at each of these core principles in detail, and then we will close our session. The first one, reality construction. Do you remember I started this session with this question, how the conception of being attained? How do we get to know the idea of being? How do we construct? How do we understand? Look, the conception of being, you need to understand this. We don't obtain the conception of being in the sense implied in the copula just by observing things that we can think of have something in common, for there is no such thing at all to be observed. I repeat, we get the conception of being not simply by observing the things that we have in common, because there is no such thing at all to be observed, but we get the conception of being through reflection. mark my words carefully, through reflection. What I mean by reflection is reflection upon a sign or upon your word or a thought. So, for example, we observe that different predicates can be attached to a subject. So, we just imagine a subject has something of it, not because of the subject being subject, but because of the predicate being attached to it. So for a subject, for a single subject, many different predicates can be attached to it. So that is what is called being. I repeat, for the sake of understanding, because this is extremely important concept. If you could understand this reality construction concept, and easy for you to understand the remaining principles, I want you to listen very carefully. I say, we don't get to understand, that is, we don't get to understand the conception of being, or we don't obtain the conception of being simply by observing the things that we can think of have something in common. What do I mean by that? If I want to know who I am, I can't get to understand who I am by relating me with other and understand who I am. Because there is nobody in the world who is exactly a look-alike or exactly having the same consciousness as I do have. So we don't get this conception of being simply by observing the things that we have in common. For there is no such thing at all in common, and there is no such thing at all to be observed. But we get this conception of being through reflection, reflecting upon a sign or a word or a thought. So we observe that, different predicates may be attached to the same subject. So we imagine the subject has something true of it merely because the predicate is attached to it, and that we call being. Hence, subject is decided by the predicate. That means subject becomes true of it merely because predicate attached to it. That's what we call by the word being. So the conception of being is therefore the conception about a sign, a thought, or a word. This is the concept. So we get to know who we are only through reflection, reflecting upon a sign, or reflecting upon your word, or reflecting upon a thought. If you could understand this, then you are halfway through towards understanding interpretative linguistics. It will be easy for you to interpret very many different interpretative theories with the help of this this conception of being, with the help of this theory. Okay, so we will, if you have still doubt, maybe you can clarify it a little later. Then we talk about the role of discursive regimes. I'm talking about the role of discourse. The discourse extremely important because the whole enterprise of knowledge making influenced by discourse. What is truth right now? Tell me. Truth is negotiated. Truth is mediated. There is nothing called fixed, as fixed reality is not there. And how do we get to understand truth? We get to understand truth only through negotiation. So when negotiation forms change, the product will change. So truth is often negotiated, compromised, it is fragmented, defragmented, understood, misunderstood, whatever it is, through discursive regimes. Hence, the whole process of knowledge making influenced by discursive regime. This is a foundational understanding of interpretive linguistics. This understanding was advanced by Michel Foucault. And then knowledge and power, politics of interpretation. As you all know, the teachers teaching in different places, you understand this. Whatever we interpret, there is politics of interpretation. You think of the concepts right now, the concept of freedom, the concept of liberty, and when you think of social practices, you think of social evils, you think of the language that we use in interpretation of it, you understand the politics. For the sake of because of certain restrictions, I don't want to give examples now. I think I restrain myself because I'm in a different context. You understand that. It's politics of interpretation, which means it is a politics which decides how we look at things, how we perceive things. It's a politics, and as a result of which there are interpretations and interpretations and interpretations and interpretations. And the interpretation which prevails over all other interpretation is the interpretation sponsored and supported by the fountain of power. I mean political power. I hope you got it. Right. The limitations of rationality. Dear friends, we think too much about rationality. But I am arguing here, rationality has got its own limitation. It is subjected to individuals' understanding of rationality. Now, what you think rationale to you may not be the same to me. What is supporting your rationality? Logic. Logic can never be a motivating force always. This is a daring statement I'm making. I'm going to prove that. Logic is and cannot be a motivating force always. Sometimes logic may be illogical. When do you think logic could become motivating force? Mind this language. Logic becomes motivating force only when logic is subjected to human feelings and emotions. You know, once logic is subjected to human feelings and emotions, it fails to be logic. Hence, logic, I'm talking about pure logic. Pure logic becomes a success as a motivating force only when it fails as pure logic. Hence, I say logic can never be a motivating force. Logic is our convenience, limitation of rationality. You know, you can even actually defend a murder. You can even say ethical dimension of murder. Take for example a person who is driving a trolley. A person is driving a trolley, and all of a sudden the brake he was not able to control the trolley. The brake off. He got to stop it, and he could find 2 persons on one side and 10 people straight at the end of the road or end of the bridge. He got to stop the trolley. He can stop it only by hitting it against some people so that he'll be able to stop this one. If he could turn, he could kill 2 people. That's enough. If he could go straight, he could kill 10 people. Now you tell me, how can you interpret the act of murder here? Can you call this murder? Can you call this ethical murder? How can we analyze it? So these are all the issues connected to, you know, applicability of rationality. So rationality does not have universal, transcendental, and foundational status. We cannot let rationality to have the claim of ascertaining truth. I repeat, we should not allow rationality to claim as if it's going to ascertain truth. So the limitation of rationality. Why I say rationality has got its own limitation? Because of a reason that I'm going to give you a little later. That reason is genealogy, that I'll talk about it a little later. Anti-foundational approach. Foucault's argument is nothing fixed. Don't accept anything for granted. Don't accept just because everyone else has accepted it. There is nothing fixed as such. Everything is negotiated. Everything is flat. You construct and deconstruct and construct and reconstruct. So construction, deconstruction, reconstruction is a continual process. Hence, what do we do? What do we get at the end of the process? We should not mind what we are going to get at the end of the process, because the process is important. The process of engagement is important. How can we bring in consciousness in the process of engagement? That is what is going to make this process a success. Hence, nothing fixed. The least questioned assumptions are the most questionable. This is another interesting statement, in support of anti-foundational approach. This is the reason why I said limitation of rationality. For information, the participant gathered over there, if you are interested, you can read my paper. I have written a paper precisely on the limitation of rationality in understanding and interpreting the provisions related to human rights law. You can Google it, and you'll be able to get it. S.A.T. Ansari is my name. You can Google it. The topic is actually human rights law, the limitation of applicability of rationality. So rationality's limitation I applied and then interpreted human rights law in different perspectives. Okay, so the reason is this: epistemology, that is truth, or understanding of truth, or understanding of our beliefs, and a justification of truth and belief, all these things subjected to genealogy of knowledge form. Louis Gates, Signifying Monkey. If you happen to read that phenomenal book by Afro-American writer, you will understand what I mean by this genealogy of knowledge form. So it is biology. It is your biology, you as a person, you as an individual, the biological factors, the biological identity, according to Louis Gates, the identity which prevails over all other identities is biological identity, because the identity that which is determined by a biology is the strongest identity according to Louis Gates. Even in terms of framing opinions, understanding the issues, genealogy has its own role to play. That's why I'm saying epistemology has to be replaced by genealogy of knowledge forms. Then coming to linguistic determinism. Um, uh, what I mean by this is actually language. We cannot escape the role of language, because the subject of anything for the matter, the subject doesn't belong to the world that we live in. The subject doesn't belong to the world that we live in, but it is the limit of the world that we have. In other words, I can say knowledge doesn't belong to the world. The knowledge is limit of my language. So we normally say, if I don't have a language, I cannot communicate. Fine. But in interpretative linguistics, we say, it's not that you cannot communicate. You cannot understand the communication. The process of knowledge assimilation stopped. So the point here is, it's language which determines your understanding of the global reality. Subject doesn't belong to the world. Subject is the limit of the world. So whatever you think you know is not because of the capacity of your mind and all, it's because of the limitation of your language. We all are limited by the language that we use. So because of the limitation of our language, because of the limitation that we all experience in different levels, our understanding limited. So that's what I mean by linguistic determinism. Language and reality construction, I talked about it in the conception of being. Subject, word, subject relation. I said subject limited by the word. Subject is not absolute. Knowledge is not absolute. Knowledge is limited by the language that we use. So language that really matters in developing consciousness, and no self-sufficient units of meaning. No word has a meaning of its own. Your word gets meaning only from the context. It's only the location of the word brings meaning to the word as such. Otherwise, your word doesn't have a meaning of its own. And words are interrelated, and meanings are often conveniently negotiated. So there is nothing called fixed meaning. This is an important, again, concept in interpretative linguistics. And then before I conclude, the research scope. The research scope in the field of, I'm going to finish it up in another 5 minutes time. Variation theory, culture theory, impossibility theory. There are plenty, but I'm touching upon only these 3 theories. In variation theory, you can use variation theory to interpret language variety. I gave an example here. I've done a research on the language employed by Toni Morrison while talking about her characters. For example, if you happen to read Blue Sky, Pecola's character, and then different other characters of Paradise and all, you'll find a kind of language. That language is Afro-American vernacular English. So what you can do, you can study that variety, the variations in morphological, syntactic, semantic, phonetic, and phonological level. I'm not for this because of the time constraint. I'm not looking deeper into these levels. We can discuss that in detail. So you can use that language. I mean, I'm talking about Afro-American vernacular English, and apply morphological, syntactic, semantic, and phonetic and phonological theories, and then try to bring out the variations between Afro-American variety and standard American English, and then educate our students that these are variations, but these are not violations. These are the variations have come to stay here. These variations are because of the different culture background, different geographical background, different ethnicity background, different education background, different political background. So we can explain these things so that students will have broader understanding of the world of differences that we live in. And a culture theory, you can apply culture theory on interpretation of concepts and ideas. On this too, I have done a research interpreting the concept of freedom. How can we interpret freedom concept and applying different culture theory? How each history or each generation shapes that particular concept according to its own convenience. So each generation shapes the concept according to its own convenience, and based on which I have written this book, Perspectives in Postmodernism, a terminological debate, applying this culture theory. I have reduced postmodern, postmodern theories to mere, linguistic jargon, or I can say, gimmicks, like kind of, it's a game of words. It's a language game like this, applying culture theory. Very interesting study. And impossibility theory, interpretation of events. I like to give an example. That is the last one. You must have, all of you, participants over there, you must have known Titanic story. I can give an example how we can apply impossibility theory on Titanic story. Titanic, I think all of you seen that. You must have read that book too. Titanic, you see the context at which the shipwreck took place. The shipwreck took place precisely at this point of time. What the point of time is, two persons of two different social classes, boy and girl, two persons of two different social classes, aristocratic one, the other one in the lower middle class or lower class. The two persons of two different social classes, when they meet and met, it was when they meet and they met, when they were about to have the fruits of that relation, it was exactly at that point of time the shipwreck took place. So what is the interpretation? Interpretation is, the ship Titanic, gigantic ship, you all know, sinking of the ship Titanic is impossible. We all know. But that impossible thing could become possible. But the possibility of a human relationship between two people of two different social classes has become impossible. The writer, he has made impossibility a possibility in order to avoid a possibility. So he has made an impossibility a possibility, and possibility has become an impossibility. So to avoid the impossibility, the point is this: to avoid the possibility of human relationship between two people of two different social classes, he has made the whole ship sink, and he has made all of us talking about the love story and tragedy and all. I would say Titanic is not a tragedy. Titanic is something which has been created to avert major tragedy. The major tragedy would have been letting these two people of two different social classes meet and match in life, and letting them have the fruits of the relationship, and facing the world which is completely prejudiced, set against them, facing the world with a challenge and confidence. That would have been the biggest tragedy. The writer did not want that tragedy to happen. It is a kind of intentional blinding, I would say, percepticide, killing the perception. That's what happened in this impossibility theory. So this is how we can apply interpretative linguistic theories on different events, concepts, and language varieties to have broader understanding of variations and differences existing within and between language. So with this brief, discussion, information, I come to the end of this session, and then open to a question answer set, because I think I've been given 50 minutes time, 40 minutes time. I've taken 5 minutes more. 50 minutes I've taken, and this is time for you to interact with me. If you got any questions on whatever I said, kindly let me know. And if there is any question for which detailed explanation required, you can mail me. I'll ask the host, the people who are hosting this, to share with you my email ID. They will share with you my email ID, or I can give you now. SAT.ANSARI@yahoo.com is my email ID. You can mail me if you have any questions on this. Delighted to answer them. Thank you for your patience. Thank you for understanding. Goodbye to you.